The crew members who were there still won't talk about it. Not really. Not about what they saw in Marilyn Monroe's eyes when Billy Wilder screamed "cut" for the 47th time. Not about the sound of pills rattling in her purse between takes. Not about how Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon would escape to the hotel bar after filming, drinking to forget what they'd witnessed that day. Working with her is like kissing Hitler, Curtis finally said to a reporter, and Hollywood gasped, not because it was cruel, but because someone had finally said out loud what everyone was thinking. August through November 1958, 4 months that should have been filled with laughter and jazz and comedy magic. Instead, the Hotel del Coronado became a prison where America's sex symbol stood trial every single day. 59 takes to ask about bourbon, 47 takes to say her character's name, and Billy Wilder, the genius director, forced to tape her lines inside dresser drawers because Marilyn's memory had become as fragile as antique glass. What destroys a woman so completely that she can't remember 3 words? The answer was building inside her, literally. Because while cameras rolled and co-stars complained and directors raged, Marilyn Monroe was pregnant, addicted, and dying from the inside out. If you want to discover the untold stories behind Hollywood's golden age, subscribe to our channel, because what happened on that set would change cinema history forever. The Hotel del Coronado stood like a white palace against the San Diego coastline, its Victorian turrets catching the August sun like something out of a fairy tale. This was supposed to be paradise, palm trees swaying in the ocean breeze, the sound of waves mixing with jazz music from the ballroom, a perfect backdrop for what would become one of the greatest comedies ever made. Billy Wilder had chosen this location carefully. He wanted authenticity, that turn-of-the-century elegance that no studio lot could replicate. But by the 3rd week of shooting, paradise had turned into purgatory. The sound of jet planes from the nearby Naval Air Station interrupted takes constantly, forcing the crew to stop and restart scenes dozens of times. Yet that technical problem would pale in comparison to what was happening with the film's star. Marilyn Monroe was late again. Not just an hour late, she hadn't shown up at all. It was 10 in the morning, and the entire cast and crew of over 100 people sat waiting, watching their per diem budgets evaporate into the California heat. Tony Curtis, sweating under layers of women's clothing and makeup for his female disguise role, checked his watch for the 30th time. Jack Lemmon paced nervously, knowing that every minute of delay was costing the studio $40,000. And Billy Wilder stood by the camera, his face a mask of controlled fury, wondering if this would be the day his entire production collapsed. When Marilyn finally arrived at 1:30 in the afternoon, she looked like she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed behind her prescription glasses, her platinum hair disheveled despite the efforts of her personal hairstylist. Paula Strasberg walked beside her like a bodyguard, whispering instructions that no one else could hear. This was the dynamic that was driving Wilder insane. Strasberg, Marilyn's acting coach from the Actors Studio in New York, had become a shadow director on his set. Every scene, every line, every gesture had to be filtered through Strasberg's method acting philosophy, which often contradicted everything Wilder wanted. The director had made masterpieces with some of Hollywood's finest actors, from Gloria Swanson to Audrey Hepburn, but he'd never encountered anything like this. It wasn't just that Marilyn questioned his direction, she seemed incapable of following anyone's direction, including her own coach's. Something fundamental had broken in the machinery of her mind, and everyone on that set could see it happening in real time. The scene they were attempting that day was simple. Marilyn's character, Sugar Kane, needed to enter a room and say, "It's me, Sugar." 3 words, 1 sentence, a line that any drama student could deliver on the first take. Wilder called action, and Marilyn opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, tried again. "It's me." She paused, her face contorting with concentration. "It's me, Sue." "No, that's not right." Wilder called cut, gently reminded her of the line, and they reset. Take 2, take 5, take 12. By take 20, Tony Curtis had stopped trying to hide his frustration. He stood there in his ridiculous wig and dress, watching America's most famous actress struggle with 3 words like a child learning to read. Take 30, take 40. At take 47, Marilyn finally said, "It's me, sugar," correctly, but by then she was crying so hard that they couldn't use the footage anyway. What the crew didn't know yet was that Marilyn was pregnant. She'd discovered it just before filming began, and the knowledge filled her with both joy and terror. This was her chance to become a mother, something she desperately wanted her entire life. But the physical demands of filming, combined with the barbiturates she was taking for anxiety and the sleeping pills that had become her nightly ritual, were creating a toxic cocktail inside her body. Every morning she woke up disoriented, her short-term memory compromised by the medication that was supposed to help her sleep. By the time she arrived on set, always late, always unprepared, her brain was functioning in a fog so thick that even simple tasks became monumental challenges, and no one could say anything about it. Not really, because Marilyn Monroe wasn't just an actress. She was a commodity worth millions of dollars, and the studio's insurance policy on her life meant that any discussion of her health problems had to be handled with extreme delicacy. Billy Wilder developed a desperate strategy. He began writing Marilyn's lines on pieces of paper and hiding them around the set, inside dresser drawers that she'd open during scenes, taped to the inside of a bourbon bottle she'd hold, attached to pieces of furniture she'd walk past. It was like creating an Easter egg hunt for a child who couldn't find her way home. The other actors watched this accommodation with a mixture of pity and resentment. They were professionals who'd memorized entire scripts, hitting their marks and delivering their lines with precision, while Marilyn received special treatment that seemed to reward her dysfunction. But Wilder knew something they didn't. Without Marilyn Monroe, there was no movie. She was the draw, the face on the poster, the reason audiences would buy tickets. Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon were talented character actors, but Marilyn was a phenomenon. So he hid her lines in drawers and bottles and waited for the magic to happen, because when it did happen, when Marilyn finally delivered a scene perfectly, it was worth every excruciating hour of waiting. The bourbon scene became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Marilyn needed to ask, "Where's that bourbon?" A simple question. 5 words. 59 takes later, the crew had stopped counting. She'd say, "Where's the whiskey?" Then, "Where's that bottle?" Then, "Where's the bonbon?" Which would have been funny if it hadn't been so tragic. Tony Curtis reached his breaking point around take 40. He stormed off set, found Jack Lemmon in his dressing room, and said words that would echo through Hollywood history. "Working with her is like kissing Hitler." Later, when a reporter asked Curtis about the comment, he didn't deny it. He explained that kissing Marilyn Monroe in their romantic scenes was the most unpleasant experience of his professional life, not because she was unattractive, but because she was so disconnected, so absent from the moment, that it felt like embracing a corpse. The comment would haunt Curtis for decades, but in that moment of exhaustion and frustration, it was simply the truth as he experienced it. Jack Lemmon tried to be more diplomatic, but even he admitted that working with Marilyn was terrifying. Not in the way that working with a demanding perfectionist might be terrifying, but in the way that watching someone self-destruct in slow motion is terrifying. Every day brought a new crisis. Sometimes Marilyn would lock herself in her dressing room and refuse to come out. Other times she'd arrive on set so heavily medicated that she could barely stand. Paula Strasberg would whisper in her ear between takes, giving her contradictory instructions that only added to her confusion. And through it all, Billy Wilder had to maintain the facade that everything was fine, that they were making a comedy, that the chaos behind the scenes wouldn't show up on screen. The miracle was that it didn't. When audiences finally saw Some Like It Hot, they saw Marilyn Monroe at her most luminous, funny, sexy, vulnerable, completely present in every scene. They had no idea that the woman on screen was fighting for her life off-screen. The miscarriage happened in late September, though most of the crew didn't learn about it until years later. Marilyn didn't announce it publicly. She simply disappeared for 3 days, claiming illness, and when she returned to set, she seemed even more fragile than before. The light had gone out of her eyes in a way that makeup couldn't fix. Billy Wilder, who'd been so angry with her for so many weeks, felt something shift in his chest when he saw her. This wasn't a difficult actress throwing a tantrum. This was a woman drowning, and everyone around her was too focused on the production schedule to throw her a life preserver. He tried to be gentler with her after that, to show more patience when she forgot her lines. But patience didn't fix Marilyn's broken memory, or heal her grief, or stop the pills she was swallowing by the handful. All it did was stretch out the production schedule and drive the insurance companies crazy with worry about their investment. Variety and other industry publications began running stories about the troubled production. They couldn't report the full truth. Studio publicity machines were too powerful for that, but they could hint at delays due to the health of a principal cast member and insurance concerns over women's health issues. That last phrase was code that everyone in Hollywood understood. Marilyn was having female problems, which could mean anything from menstrual difficulties to mental breakdown to pregnancy complications. The vagueness of the language allowed the studio to protect its asset while simultaneously preparing the industry for potential disaster. If Marilyn couldn't finish the film, if she had a complete breakdown or worse, the insurance policy would kick in and minimize the financial damage. But insurance money couldn't replace the irreplaceable. Without Marilyn Monroe, Some Like It Hot would just be another comedy about men in drag. With her, it would become immortal. The relationship between Wilder and Strasberg deteriorated into open warfare by October. Wilder wanted natural, instinctive performances from his actors. Strasberg wanted deep method work, emotional preparation, psychological excavation of every moment. For Marilyn, caught between these two authorities, the conflicting demands became paralyzing. She'd prepare a scene one way with Strasberg in her dressing room, then come to set and find Wilder wanted something completely different. The resulting confusion meant even more takes, even more delays, even more frustration all around. Wilder began to actively exclude Strasberg from the set, which only made Marilyn more anxious and dependent on her coach's approval. It was a vicious cycle that fed on itself, and at the center of it was a woman who couldn't remember 3 words but somehow had to carry an entire film on her shoulders. Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon developed their own coping mechanism, drinking. After particularly brutal days of shooting, they'd retreat to the hotel bar and try to process what they'd witnessed. The horror wasn't that Marilyn was difficult. Difficult actors were nothing new in Hollywood. The horror was that she seemed to be genuinely, helplessly lost. She wanted to be good, wanted to remember her lines, wanted to give Wilder what he needed. But something in her brain had short-circuited, and no amount of effort or willpower could fix it. Curtis would later say that watching Marilyn struggle was like watching someone drown while everyone around them debated the proper rescue technique. By the time anyone agreed on what to do, it would be too late. And it almost was too late. The production came within days of shutting down completely when Marilyn's absences and delays pushed the budget to breaking point. But then something extraordinary happened. In early November, with only 2 weeks of shooting left, Marilyn had what crew members later described as a window of clarity. Maybe the pregnancy hormones had stabilized, maybe she'd adjusted her medication, maybe she'd simply reached a point of exhaustion where her body stopped fighting and surrendered to the work. Whatever the reason, she showed up on time, remembered her lines, and delivered performance after performance that reminded everyone why she was a star. The final scenes of the film, the emotional moments where Sugar Cane reveals her vulnerability and hope for love, were shot in just a few takes each. Marilyn was present, focused, luminous. Billy Wilder watched through the camera and felt tears in his eyes, not because the scene was sad, but because he was finally seeing the actress he'd hired, the talent he'd believed in, breaking through the fog of her illness. Those last 2 weeks saved the film. The studio breathed a collective sigh of relief. The insurance companies stopped sending threatening letters. Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, who'd spent months complaining about their co-star, found themselves genuinely impressed by what she could do when her mind was working properly. The chemistry between the 3 leads became real, the comedy timing clicked into place, and what had been a chaotic assemblage of disconnected scenes suddenly cohered into something magical. Wilder knew he had something special. He could feel it in the dailies, see it in the reactions of the crew. Some Like It Hot wasn't just going to be another comedy, it was going to be a classic. The film wrapped in late November, and Marilyn Monroe disappeared from public view for several weeks. She was exhausted, grief-stricken over the miscarriage she'd never publicly acknowledged, and terrified about what working on the film had cost her physically and mentally. Billy Wilder gave an interview where he said, with characteristic bluntness, that he was now so rich and old that I don't need to work with Marilyn Monroe again, even if it's a movie about her. The comment seemed harsh, but those who'd been on set understood what he really meant. Working with Marilyn in her current state wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous, both to the production and to Marilyn herself. He cared about her enough to know that the Hollywood machine was grinding her to dust, and he didn't want to be part of that destruction anymore. When Some Like It Hot premiered in March 1959, it became an instant sensation. Critics raved about the performances, especially Marilyn's portrayal of Sugar Cane. Audiences laughed at the brilliant comedy and fell in love with Marilyn's vulnerability and charm. The film would go on to be nominated for multiple Academy Awards and would eventually be recognized as one of the greatest comedies ever made. But the people who'd been on that set in San Diego couldn't watch it without seeing the ghosts behind every scene. Every perfectly delivered line represented dozens of failed attempts. Every moment of Marilyn's luminous screen presence concealed hours of tears and frustration and memory loss. The final product was magic, but the process had been a nightmare that no one wanted to repeat. Tony Curtis would spend the rest of his life trying to explain his kissing Hitler comment. He'd claim it was a joke, that he'd been misquoted, that he'd actually had great respect for Marilyn's talent. But the truth was more complicated than any single explanation could capture. Yes, working with Marilyn had been frustrating to the point of madness. Yes, her inability to remember lines and her constant lateness had made everyone's job exponentially harder. But Curtis also recognized, in retrospect, that he'd been witnessing a medical crisis, not just a temperamental actress throwing tantrums. Marilyn Monroe wasn't being difficult on purpose. She was being destroyed by a combination of pregnancy complications, barbiturate addiction, and untreated mental health issues that 1950s Hollywood had no framework for understanding or addressing. Jack Lemmon, always more diplomatic, would later say that Marilyn was the most frightened person he'd ever worked with. That fear, he realized, wasn't about forgetting lines or disappointing directors. It was existential terror, the fear that if she couldn't perform, if she couldn't be Marilyn Monroe anymore, she would cease to exist entirely. Her identity had become so completely fused with her public persona that any crack in that facade felt like death itself. And on the set of Some Like It Hot, those cracks were showing every single day. The question wasn't whether Marilyn Monroe would break, it was how much longer she could hold the pieces together before everything collapsed completely. Billy Wilder's relationship with Marilyn remained complicated for the rest of her life. He admired her talent enormously. In interviews, he'd often say that when Marilyn was on, when her mind was clear and her instincts were working, she was the most naturally gifted comedic actress he'd ever directed. But he also recognized that something fundamental in her was broken, and that the Hollywood system that had created Marilyn Monroe was also killing the woman born Norma Jean. He refused to work with her again, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of protective instinct. Another production like Some Like It Hot might not end with a successful film, it might end with tragedy. And 3 years later, when Marilyn died under mysterious circumstances in her Brentwood home, Wilder was one of the few directors who wasn't surprised. He'd seen it coming since that August day in 1958 when she couldn't remember 3 simple words. The legacy of Some Like It Hot remains untouched by the chaos of its creation. Film students study it as a masterpiece of timing, structure, and performance. Audiences discover it generation after generation and fall in love with Marilyn's Sugar Cane, sweet, hopeful, beautifully vulnerable. But for those who were there on that San Diego set, who watched the 47 takes and the 59 attempts and the tears behind the laughter, the film is haunted. Every frame contains the shadow of what it cost to create. And that cost was measured not just in dollars or delayed schedules, but in pieces of Marilyn Monroe's mind and body and soul that she'd never get back. The Hotel del Coronado still stands today. That white Victorian palace by the sea. Tourists visit it, take photos, marvel at its historic beauty. Some of them know that Some Like It Hot was filmed there, but they don't know about the woman who couldn't remember her lines, who lost a baby during production, who was fighting a losing battle against addiction and depression while the cameras rolled. They don't know about Tony Curtis comparing her to Hitler, or Billy Wilder taping script pages inside furniture, or the insurance companies calculating the dollar value of a human breakdown. They see the magic on screen and assume it was magical to create. But magic in Hollywood often requires blood sacrifice, and Marilyn Monroe was bleeding out one take at a time. The question that haunts everyone who studies this period of Marilyn's life is whether it could have been different. Could the studio have given her more time to recover from the miscarriage? Could her doctors have intervened more aggressively with her medication dependency? Could Paula Strasberg's method coaching have been less demanding and more supportive? Could Billy Wilder have been more patient from the beginning, before frustration turned to anger? The answer to all these questions is probably yes. But Hollywood in 1958 didn't operate on compassion or medical understanding. It operated on schedules and budgets and star power. Marilyn Monroe was worth millions of dollars as long as she could perform, and the system would extract every last ounce of that value before it discarded her. The miracle of Some Like It Hot isn't that it got made despite the chaos, it's that Marilyn survived the production at all. Tony Curtis carried guilt about his harsh words for the rest of his life. In later interviews, he'd try to walk them back to explain the context, to make people understand that he'd been exhausted and frustrated and scared, but the words remained, preserved in Hollywood history like a fossil of a particular moment's cruelty. Like kissing Hitler, the comparison was so extreme, so deliberately shocking, that it revealed the depth of Curtis's anger and helplessness. He wasn't just complaining about a difficult co-star, he was confessing that working with Marilyn Monroe in 1958 felt like participating in something monstrous, something that violated basic human decency. And he wasn't wrong. The system that forced a pregnant, addicted, mentally ill woman to work 14-hour days and perform complex comedy scenes while her memory was disintegrating, that system was monstrous. Curtis's mistake was blaming Marilyn for a situation she hadn't created and couldn't control. The bourbon scene, 59 takes for 5 words, became a dark legend in Hollywood. Young actors would hear about it and wonder how anyone could struggle that much with such a simple line. But they didn't understand that Marilyn's problem wasn't acting ability, it was brain chemistry. The barbiturates she was taking, combined with the hormonal chaos of pregnancy and miscarriage, had created cognitive impairment that no amount of talent or willpower could overcome. Every time Billy Wilder called action, Marilyn's mind went blank, scrambling desperately to retrieve information that should have been right there but had somehow vanished into a fog of pharmaceutical confusion. It was terrifying for her, frustrating for everyone around her, and ultimately tragic because no one had the medical knowledge or institutional framework to intervene effectively. Billy Wilder's decision to hide script lines around the set was both brilliant and heartbreaking. Brilliant because it solved an immediate practical problem and allowed filming to continue. Heartbreaking because it revealed just how far Marilyn had fallen from the confident performer she'd once been. She'd started her career as a model and bit-part actress, working her way up through talent and determination. By 1958, she was one of the most famous women in the world, and she couldn't remember 5 words without visual aids hidden in furniture. The contrast between her public image and her private struggle was so extreme that it bordered on surreal. Millions of people fantasized about Marilyn Monroe while Marilyn herself could barely function well enough to do her job. The film's success made everything more complicated. If Some Like It Hot had been a disaster, if the tortured production process had resulted in an unwatchable mess, then the story would be simple. Hollywood pushed Marilyn too far and the results were predictably catastrophic. But instead, the film was magnificent. Marilyn's performance was among her finest work, funny, touching, layered with vulnerability and hope. So what did that mean? Was the suffering worth it if the art was great? Did the 47 takes and 59 attempts and hidden script pages somehow contribute to the magic on screen? Or were they entirely separate, the chaos of creation versus the beauty of the created thing? These questions troubled Billy Wilder for years after Marilyn's death. He'd made a masterpiece, but at what cost to his star? When Marilyn Monroe died in August 1962, just 4 years after Some Like It Hot wrapped, the people who'd worked on that film weren't surprised. They'd seen the trajectory clearly. A woman being consumed by forces she couldn't control, ground down by an industry that valued her image more than her well-being, trapped in a cycle of medication and despair that had no obvious exit. Tony Curtis heard the news and felt a complicated mix of guilt and inevitability. Jack Lemmon remembered her fear and wished he'd done more to help. Billy Wilder thought about the woman who couldn't remember 3 words and wondered if he could have saved her by refusing to make the film at all. But Hollywood doesn't work that way. Someone else would have directed Some Like It Hot. Someone else would have pushed Marilyn through those 59 takes. The machine was bigger than any individual, and once it got hold of someone like Marilyn Monroe, beautiful, vulnerable, infinitely marketable, it wouldn't let go until there was nothing left to exploit. Some Like It Hot remains a comedy classic, celebrated for its wit and performances and timeless appeal. But it's also a monument to a particular kind of Hollywood cruelty, the cruelty of efficiency, of schedules prioritized over human welfare, of art created through suffering that no one wanted to acknowledge or address. The crew members who were there still don't talk about it. Not really. Not about the pills or the tears or the 47 takes for 3 words, because to talk about it honestly would be to admit complicity in a system that destroys the people it claims to celebrate. And it's easier to remember the magic on screen than to face the nightmare that created it.